The Dark Secret of the Dubai Sheikh. Unbelievable true crime story uncovered. Hook. What happens when a man is cursed by darkness itself, trapped in a mansion with unimaginable terror? The Sheikh's curse was only the beginning, and escaping it might be the least of his problems. Watch as the chilling journey unfolds, revealing a truth darker than anyone could have ever imagined. Are you ready to face the shadows with him? Keep watching till the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The night was still. The stars flickered above Dubai, barely visible through the haze. But something stirred in the air, a feeling that could not be ignored. The streets were quiet, unusually so. Not a single car passed. A figure emerged from the shadows, dressed in a black suit, his face obscured by a dark veil. He moved swiftly, with purpose. He had been planning this for months. A mansion loomed ahead, magnificent, its golden lights gleaming in the distance. It was the Sheikh's private palace, the heart of Dubai's power. The man paused for a moment, listening to the faint sound of a distant hum. It was a security system, alert and vigilant, but he knew what he was doing. He'd studied the Sheikh's routines, the guards' patterns, the most vulnerable spot. He'd slipped in before, and now he would return to finish what he started. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow. Someone was watching. He froze, his breath shallow, slow. The silence stretched. Then the figure moved again, closer and closer. Was it a guard? No, it wasn't a guard. It was a woman. Her presence was eerie, as though she wasn't supposed to be here at all. She was staring at him, unblinking. A strange calmness washed over him. Her eyes locked onto his. He moved cautiously, his footsteps barely audible. But she didn't flinch. She simply stood there, watching, her dark eyes never leaving his. He felt his heart pound. Every muscle in his body tensed. He had to keep moving. He could not let her stop him now. But something about her still unsettled him. There was an energy around her, an aura. He had to go inside. He took a breath. He stepped forward. The woman didn't budge. Her gaze followed him like a shadow. He approached the side door, and that's when it hit him he was not alone. Not anymore. The air felt thick, chilling, as if time had slowed. Something was wrong. He reached for the door handle, and then nothing. The world around him seemed to stop. The woman had vanished. No footsteps. No rustling of fabric. Just silence. But he wasn't alone. Not anymore. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The night had changed. The mansion ahead suddenly seemed darker, menacing. Was it the walls, or something inside? He stepped back cautiously, but the feeling it wouldn't go away. It was too late to turn back now. He had to continue. The time was now. It was his only chance. His hand gripped the door handle. The cold metal sent a shiver through his fingers. He turned it slowly, carefully. The door creaked open, just a fraction. Enough for him to slip inside. The mansion was dark, the air stale, thick with the scent of old wood and polished marble. Every step he took echoed through the vast halls. His heart raced in time with his footsteps. A faint sound came from somewhere deeper within. It was soft, a whisper, almost like a voice. But no, it was just the wind, surely. He kept moving. The walls seemed to close in on him as he ventured deeper. The halls twisted and turned, leading him into the heart of the palace. He reached a large, ornate door. He paused. This was it. He pushed the door open. Inside, a large room stretched before him. It was lavishly decorated. Gold accents gleamed under the dim light. The Sheikh's private study. It was exactly as he had imagined. Every detail was perfect, but something felt off. The room was too still, too quiet. He stepped in, his eyes scanning every corner. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. He whirled around. No one. The room was empty, just him, and the heavy silence. But then he saw it. A small, flickering light in the far corner. A candle. Its flame danced nervously. He walked toward it, the faint light casting long shadows on the walls. As he drew closer, he noticed something strange. The candle wasn't just a candle. It was attached to a small, ornate box. The box had a strange symbol carved into its surface. It looked ancient. He reached for it, his fingers trembling. But as soon as he touched it, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned. The floor creaked. He pulled his hand away, but the box wouldn't budge. It had latched onto him. A voice echoed in his mind. A voice he had not heard before. You shouldn't have come. His breath caught in his throat. The temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows around him seemed to grow. He could feel them closing in. A presence. He wasn't alone anymore. And it wasn't the Sheikh who would stop him. Not tonight. Something else. Something far older. And far more dangerous. The voice returned, but this time it wasn't in his mind. It was real. Leave or you'll never escape. He spun around. The room was no longer the study. It was darker. Twisted. A vast, empty cavern. A cold wind howled through the air. And then, from the darkness, figures emerged. Tall, shadowy figures, their faces obscured. They were coming closer. And there was nowhere to hide. The shadows moved with purpose, gliding through the air, as though they weren't bound by the laws of the physical world. The figure closest to him raised its arm. A cold, bone-chilling wind swept across the room. His body froze. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as if the very air itself had turned against him. The shadows encircled him, closing in tighter, tighter. He could hear the low murmur of their voices, soft, unsettling whispers that filled his mind. They were not human. You're not supposed to be here. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The cold grew unbearable. He felt his legs buckle, his knees giving way. But he couldn't fall. His body refused to obey. It was as if the shadows were holding him upright. The figure in front of him moved closer. Its face remained hidden in darkness, but the air around it shimmered. A strange, oppressive energy pulsed from the figure. His heart raced. The darkness seemed to press in from every direction, smothering him. Suddenly, the voice broke through the whispers. The Sheikh's blood is ours. The words hit him like a physical blow. He gasped for air. What did it mean? What was happening? The shadows seemed to grow even darker, as though feeding on his confusion. The air tasted of metal and fear. He tried to speak, to ask what was going on, but no words came out, only a ragged breath. The figure raised its hand again, and the temperature dropped even further. He could see his breath, rising in front of him like smoke, but it wasn't the cold that terrified him. It was the eyes that appeared in the darkness. Hundreds of them, staring at him, watching, waiting. His body trembled, but he couldn't break free. The shadows tightened their grip. He was suffocating, trapped in this nightmare. He could feel his strength slipping away. Every second felt like an eternity. And then a sudden shift. The figures paused. Their gaze turned towards the far corner of the room. A low growl echoed. The shadows seemed to recoil. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, powerful. It was the Sheikh, but he wasn't the same. His eyes glowed with a strange light, a malevolent fire that burned through the darkness. He raised a hand, and the shadows parted, creating a clear path toward him. The Sheikh spoke, his voice cold and dark. You've come too far. The air vibrated with the weight of his words. And then, before he could react, the Sheikh moved. Faster than he could comprehend. The shadows surged, and in a flash, everything went black, but he couldn't breathe. Everything was suffocating. The darkness pressed in on him, heavier than ever before. He felt his body being pulled, dragged through the abyss. His heart pounded, faster now, as if trying to escape the suffocating grip of the shadows. He reached out, desperate for something solid, something real. But there was nothing but cold, and that burning sensation in his chest. The same cold that the Sheikh had summoned. It consumed him. Suddenly, the pull stopped. The darkness released him, and he fell hard onto cold stone. He gasped, coughing, choking on the air that finally reached his lungs. But the room was different now. It wasn't the study anymore. The walls were ancient, crumbling, the air thick with age, dust, and something darker. He tried to push himself up, but his body felt heavy like lead. His hands shook as he braced himself against the floor. What was happening? Where was he? His eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar surroundings. The room was vast, an underground chamber, far from the mansion. The stone walls were lined with ancient symbols, etched into the surface like scars. The floor beneath him was cold, uneven. A flickering light came from a distant torch on the wall, and in the center of the room, a massive stone altar stood. It was stained with something dark. The shadows were gone, but the air was still thick. Then a voice, low, commanding, "You are in my domain now." It wasn't the Sheikh's voice. It was deeper, older. He looked up, his eyes widening in horror. There, standing above him, was a figure cloaked in tattered robes, a presence so ancient it seemed to warp the very air around it. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face. But it wasn't a face. It was an empty, hollow space, filled with the faintest glow, like the last dying embers of a fire. And then it spoke again. "This place is where your fate ends." The words seemed to tear through him. He could feel the weight of the darkness closing in once again. The figure raised its hand, and a cold, terrible wind howled through the chamber. The air vibrated, shaking the stone walls. The shadows returned, but this time they were different. They weren't just around him. They were inside him, twisting, writhing. His heart raced again, but it wasn't his heart anymore. The air felt suffocating, but the cold wasn't from the room. It was from within him. The figure took a step forward, its hollow eyes burning into him. "Asterisk, you've come to claim the Sheikh's power, but that power is not meant for mortals, asterisk." The words cut through him like a blade. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The figure's hand extended, and the shadows began to twist faster, stronger. He couldn't fight it. He was losing himself, losing control. The darkness swallowed him whole, and in that final moment he understood. The true crime was not in what he had come to take. It was in what he had become, a part of the ancient curse, a prisoner of the Sheikh's twisted legacy. He could feel his soul slipping, like sand through his fingers. The shadows twisted inside him, their grip tightening with each passing second. His thoughts blurred, the world around him distorted, as though it was being swallowed by the void. He could no longer tell where the darkness ended and where he began. The figure loomed over him, its empty eyes still fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "This is the price for ambition," the figure whispered, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. He tried to scream, but his voice was drowned out by the growing roar of the shadows. His body was no longer his own. His limbs were stiff, rigid, as if some invisible force had taken control. The darkness inside him pulsed, cold and relentless, crawling under his skin, spreading like poison through his veins. "The Sheikh's blood runs through you now," the figure said, its voice growing fainter, as though it was fading into the distance. The words didn't make sense, but they didn't need to. His vision darkened, and the cold spread until it consumed him entirely. The room, The altar, the figure, they all disappeared. And then nothing. No sound, no light, just a suffocating emptiness. He was trapped, suspended in a void where time no longer existed. His mind screamed for release, for escape, but the shadows had taken everything from him. His memories were slipping away, fading like a distant dream. And then, in the blackness, a faint flicker of light appeared. A single candle, its flame dancing wildly in the dark. He couldn't move toward it. He couldn't even reach out, but he could feel its warmth. It was the only thing left in this suffocating void. The shadows were gone, but the cold remained. And with it, the whispering voice, soft, insistent, like a breath at the back of his mind. You belong to this place now. And for the first time, he understood. There was no escape, no redemption. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. The Sheikh's curse had claimed him, as it had claimed countless others before him. He was a part of it now, locked in the darkness forever. A prisoner to the shadows. A prisoner to the legacy of the Sheikh. And there was no turning back. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. He had no sense of time, no sense of self. His thoughts were scattered, distant whispers buried beneath the weight of the darkness. But then, as though pulled by an invisible force, his mind began to clear, just enough to feel the flicker of awareness. The candle, the faint warmth, it was still there, burning in the distance, offering the smallest comfort in a world swallowed by shadows. He tried to reach for it, to pull himself toward it, but his body refused to obey. His limbs were heavy, bound by something unseen, something that pressed down with a suffocating force. Yet, he wasn't completely powerless. A single thought flickered through his mind. The Sheikh, the man who had pulled him into this nightmare, the man whose power had cursed him. But the more he thought of the Sheikh, the more he understood. The Sheikh was not just a man. He was a vessel for something older, darker, that had been hiding in the shadows for centuries. The curse that had consumed him, this was not just about greed or ambition. It was something much older than that. Something ancient, rooted in the very foundations of Dubai itself. He could feel it now, the connection between him and the Sheikh. The bloodline, the power, the curse. He was no longer separate from it. He was a part of it. The shadows shifted around him, swirling faster, growing thicker. He could feel them drawing closer, like an inescapable tide, pulling him deeper into their grasp. The figure appeared again, its empty eyes glowing in the dark. You will never leave this place. The words were like chains, wrapping around him, binding him in the cold abyss. But there was a sudden crackle of energy in the air, a spark of defiance. Someone was fighting back. He couldn't see them, but he could feel their presence, faint but determined. The candle's flame flickered wildly, its light growing brighter. For a moment, the shadows hesitated, and in that moment of weakness, he gathered what little strength remained. He wasn't completely lost, not yet. With everything he had left, he reached out toward the light. He couldn't explain it, but the darkness seemed to recoil as his hand neared the flame. The shadows screeched, a sound so terrible that it almost shattered his mind. But it was enough. The light intensified, growing into a blinding flare that tore through the void. The figure vanished, the shadows scattered, and in that brief, blinding moment, he felt something shift, something break. The emptiness around him dissolved. He was falling into the light. But as his body plunged into the brightness, he felt something else. A presence. Something watching. Something waiting. And he knew, in the depths of his soul, that this was not the end. Not yet. The curse had only begun. And the Sheikh's legacy, its reach, would follow him wherever he went. The light consumed him, swallowing everything in its path. It was both blinding and beautiful, a force beyond comprehension. For a moment, he felt weightless, as though his very existence was being torn apart and remade. But then the light flickered, dimming, and he fell into an abyss once more. The sensation was nauseating, as if he were tumbling through endless space, through a world without form. The warmth of the light was gone, replaced by the suffocating cold that had haunted him before. He landed hard on stone. The impact rattled his bones, but he forced himself to open his eyes. He was back, but this place wasn't the same. It was the mansion again, the grand palace of the Sheikh. Yet it was different, twisted. The air was thick with something dark. The walls were crumbling, the marble floors cracked and stained with something dark. A faint, unsettling glow illuminated the space. Shadows shifted, not of their own accord, but with purpose, as if they were alive. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant echo of his own breath. And then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from somewhere nearby, but the sound was distorted, as if traveling through thick glass. It was too quiet to identify at first, but as it grew louder, the truth began to settle in. It was footsteps. Footsteps approaching. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. Slowly he stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. The air tasted like metal, like blood. And then, through the haze, he saw a figure. A silhouette in the shadows. It was tall, unnervingly still. And the moment it stepped into the dim light, he felt his breath catch. The figure was the Sheikh, but it wasn't the man he had seen before. This was something else entirely. The Sheikh's eyes glowed with that same fire he had seen before, but now they burned with an intensity that was terrifying. His form seemed stretched, distorted, as though reality itself was bending around him. And in his hands he held something, a sword, but not a normal sword. This one was made of darkness itself, its edges flickering with an unnatural, inky energy. The Sheikh stepped forward, his movement unnervingly smooth. The room seemed to shrink with every step he took. "You have returned," the Sheikh's voice rumbled, low and guttural, like a growl from deep within the earth. The words were cold, carrying with them an unspoken promise. The curse was far from over. "You belong to the shadows now." His voice echoed through the empty halls, reverberating off the walls, wrapping around him like chains. The light flickered once more, a brief flash of defiance before it died completely. And then the room fell into an even deeper darkness. The shadows surged forward, curling around the Sheikh like a cloak. And in that moment he knew. This was no longer just about the Sheikh's power. It was about something far older, something rooted in the very essence of this place. Something that had waited for centuries, feeding on the ambition of men like him. The shadows didn't just belong to the Sheikh. They were the Sheikh. The power had always been inside him, and now it was inside him too. The darkness reached out, pulling him closer. The presence of the Sheikh, his curse, his legacy, was inescapable. And no matter how much he tried to fight it, no matter how much he struggled to break free, he could feel himself slipping again, falling deeper into the void. There was no escape. Not anymore. And as the Sheikh stepped closer, raising the dark sword high, the final blow seemed inevitable. The shadows began to consume him once more. And this time there would be no light, no flicker of hope, only darkness, endlessly. Forever the sword came down in a blur of motion, a streak of darkness that seemed to slice through the air like a blade of pure night. But it didn't hit him. He felt a sudden surge of power, an instinct to survive, and without thinking, he twisted away just in time. The sword's edge grazed the air, and the room shook with the force of its passage. The darkness trembled. He could feel the weight of it, the force that had once claimed him, beginning to shift. The shadows recoiled, as if the darkness itself feared something. For a moment he stood there, breathless, hands trembling. What had just happened? His heart pounded in his chest, the fear still gripping him. But something had changed. The darkness was uncertain. He looked up to see the Sheikh's figure, frozen in place, the sword raised high. His eyes were wide, glowing brighter now, as if the light inside him was unstable, flickering dangerously. And then it happened. The figure of the Sheikh distorted, his form warping in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His body seemed to split and fold, like a reflection in broken glass. The air trembled, vibrating with a strange energy. A low, guttural scream echoed from the Sheikh's throat. It was a sound of rage, of pain. The darkness around him pulsed violently, growing and retracting, as if something was struggling to break free. He could see it now, beneath the Sheikh's eyes, a flicker of something ancient, something alive. The Sheikh wasn't just a man. He was the vessel, a vessel for a force far more powerful than either of them could understand. And that force was desperate to escape. The shadows seemed to twist, warping around the Sheikh like a storm, pulling him in all directions. The sword, once a weapon of darkness, now seemed to waver in the Sheikh's hand, as if it too was part of the struggle. And in that moment, the truth became clear. The curse wasn't just a thing of the past. It was alive, alive in the very walls of this place, in the air they breathed. The Sheikh had been its first victim, but now he was becoming part of it. The shadows surged, their tendrils reaching out, not just for him, but for everything, for the mansion, for the world beyond. He could feel it, feel the immense power growing stronger, threatening to burst free, and there was only one thing left to do. He had to stop it, before it consumed them both. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he lunged forward, charging at the Sheikh. The sword in the Sheikh's hand swung down, but this time he was ready. With a desperate, final push, he grabbed the sword, yanking it away from the Sheikh's grasp. The darkness howled in fury, its voice now a deafening roar, as if the very universe was crying out in terror. The sword pulsed with dark energy, but he held on, refusing to let it go. He knew this was the key. He had to sever the connection. With a fierce cry, he drove the sword into the heart of the darkness itself. The room exploded with a blinding flash. The Sheikh's scream echoed through the air, and then silence. The air cleared. The darkness lifted. The mansion, the shadows, the curse, they all faded away. He was left standing in an empty room. The sword, still in his hand, was now nothing more than a normal blade. And the Sheikh? Gone. The power, the curse, everything had been extinguished. But as he stood there, panting, he realized one thing. It wasn't over. The darkness still lingered in his mind. A quiet whisper. A presence always there. The curse had been broken. But the legacy of the Sheikh, it was inside him now. And that was a fate worse than death. He had survived. But at what cost? He stood motionless, the sword heavy in his hand, the echo of the Sheikh's final scream still ringing in his ears. The room around him was eerily calm, the shadows receding, but the silence was suffocating. He could feel the weight of the darkness, lingering like a cloud inside his chest. It wasn't gone, not truly. He looked at the blade in his hand, its dark energy now extinguished, its surface gleaming innocently. But it was more than just a weapon. It was a reminder. The curse had been broken in one sense, but it had woven itself into his very being. The shadows had left the mansion, but they had entered him, buried deep beneath his skin, waiting for the moment they could rise again. He took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself, to make sense of the chaos inside him. But there was no clarity. He was no longer sure where the shadows ended and he began. His mind felt like a battlefield, each thought a struggle against the growing darkness that pulsed within him. A flicker of A movement caught his eye. He turned sharply, expecting another manifestation of the curse. But there was nothing, only the empty, crumbling mansion. Yet he wasn't alone, not in the way he had been before. The presence, silent, waiting, was there, always hovering at the edges of his awareness. It was inside him. The curse had claimed him, yes, but now it whispered in the back of his mind. The Sheikh's voice, distant but clear. "You cannot escape me." It was a sentence that echoed through every corner of his mind. He felt the walls of his consciousness begin to crack. The curse hadn't just been about power. It was about control. It was about breaking him, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the darkness. And as the shadows stirred within him, he knew there was no way to undo it, no way to cleanse himself of what he had become. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "I am not you," he whispered to the emptiness. But the voice returned, louder now, mocking. "You already are." He staggered back, his breath ragged, his pulse quickening. The mansion around him felt unfamiliar. He had escaped the physical prison, but now he was trapped in a far worse one. A prison of his own mind. The shadows were growing stronger, rising within him, feeding on his fear, his anger. There was no more fight left in him, no more hope, only the lingering echoes of the Sheikh's curse, wrapped around his soul, tightening with each passing moment. He fell to his knees, the weight of it all crashing down. The curse was never just about the Sheikh's power. It was about consumption. It was about devouring the soul. And he was its latest victim. The shadows inside him surged, rising up in a final, overwhelming wave. He could feel it, the power, the darkness. It was complete, and with one last, crushing breath he understood. The Sheikh had never truly been the vessel. He had been the key, and now the true curse had found its final home. In him, and it would never let go. The mansion, the shadows, the curse, they all faded into oblivion. But he remained, a part of something darker than he could ever comprehend. A prisoner in the very soul of the Sheikh. Forever. The silence was unbearable. For a moment, he felt as if time had stopped. The weight of the curse pressed down on him, suffocating. But then, slowly, something shifted within him. Something stirred in the depths of his mind. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but the sensation was unmistakable. A presence, darker and older, coiled within him, watching. He wasn't alone, and yet he felt more isolated than ever. The darkness had become a part of him, a stain on his soul that refused to fade. The shadows whispered again, faint but persistent. "You are mine now," the words scraped at his mind, jagged and cruel. He tried to push them away, to fight, but it was futile. It had already won. The curse had twisted itself into his very being, tangled in his thoughts, in his breath. He was no longer the man who had walked into the Sheikh's mansion all those days ago. He was something else now, a vessel, a prisoner, and the worst part, he could feel the darkness growing, spreading. It wasn't just within him, it was becoming him. The walls of his mind began to blur, his thoughts no longer his own. He could hear the whispers more clearly now, urging him, coaxing him. "Asterisk, do you feel it? The power. It's yours, asterisk." He wanted to scream, to fight it, but no sound came from his throat. His body was no longer his own. The mansion around him flickered again, the cracked walls and shattered marble floor appearing and disappearing in waves. He wasn't sure if he was still there, or if he had slipped into some other realm, some endless purgatory. The shadows pressed in, smothering him, drowning him in their suffocating embrace. But then, amidst the darkness, he saw something. A single, flickering flame. It was faint, weak, but it was there. A candle. Its light felt familiar. A glimmer of hope, barely there, but enough to spark something inside him. He reached for it. His hand moved on its own, desperate, trembling. The shadows screamed, recoiling as his fingers closed around the base of the candle. The presence within him stirred and raged, but he held on. The candle's light grew brighter, stronger, until it illuminated the room, pushing back the darkness. For a brief moment he felt a surge of control, a fleeting sense of power. The whispers faded, silenced for the time being, as if the light had forced them into hiding. He looked at the flame, his chest heaving with exertion. Could it be? Could the light push the darkness away? No, he knew the truth. The darkness was too strong, too deep. It wasn't something that could be banished with a flicker of light. But in that moment, he realized something far more terrifying. The darkness hadn't fully consumed him yet. He still had a choice between surrender and defiance, a choice to let the shadows claim him completely, or to hold on to whatever sliver of humanity remained. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The candle's light flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. And in the silence, he made his decision. He would fight. Even if the darkness tore him apart, even if it devoured his soul, he would fight. For as long as the flame still burned, he wouldn't give up. Because if he surrendered now, if he let the shadows consume him completely, he knew one thing for certain. There would be no coming back. And so, with trembling hands and a heart that barely beat, he stood. The shadows moved, but he did too. He held the candle high, the faint light his only ally, and faced the encroaching darkness. The battle was far from over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel completely lost. But he knew this was only the beginning. The curse was not finished with him, and neither was he. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, but he could feel the warmth of the candle in his hand, a fragile shield against the encroaching abyss. He didn't know how much longer he could hold it. The shadows seemed to pulse, as if testing the strength of his resolve, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape this," they murmured, like 1,000 voices clawing at his mind. But he stood his ground, each breath a struggle, each heartbeat like a drumbeat in the war against the dark. He could feel the presence inside him, the dark force coiling tighter, its grip tightening with every passing second. But he would not let it take him, not yet. The candle flickered, threatening to die out, but he refused to let it go. The light seemed to grow weaker, its flame unstable, as if it too was caught in the same struggle. "It's futile," the voice inside him whispered. "You cannot fight what is already inside you." His grip on the candle tightened. He would not give in. The shadows swirled around him, wrapping themselves like tendrils around his body, pulling, tugging at his mind, seeking control. But he fought it. With every ounce of strength left, he pushed back against the darkness. His legs were shaking, his arms heavy, but he refused to collapse. He could hear the shadows, feel them, but he fought to stay focused on the light. It was all he had left. And then, suddenly a sound, a crack, like thunder breaking the air. The walls around him began to tremble. The darkness, the shadows, they were shifting, retreating. He didn't understand it at first, but then he realized the mansion. The whole place was beginning to crumble. The foundation was shaking, the air thick with the sound of breaking stone. The shadows screamed in fury, their voices rising in a cacophony of rage. The darkness that had consumed him, that had bound him, was being forced back. For a moment, he thought he might be free, but then he saw it. Through the cracks in the walls, through the breaking marble floors, something else emerged. A figure, the Sheikh. But this time, he wasn't just a man. He was something more. His form cracked and shifting, as if it were being pulled from the depths of the shadows themselves. The Sheikh's eyes were hollow, voids of pure darkness, and his body seemed to be both there and not there, as if he were a part of the very air. "You think you have won." The Sheikh's voice echoed, a deep, resonating sound that shook the room. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, sending tremors through his body. The Sheikh's figure began to move, floating effortlessly, his form stretching, like liquid darkness, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around him. He reached out, and the shadows reached with him, swirling together, merging with his figure, forming something ancient, something vast. "This is not the end," the Sheikh growled, his voice reverberating through the room. "It is only the beginning." The air grew colder, and the shadows grew darker, stretching and creeping toward him, intent on dragging him back into their grasp. But the candle still burned in his hand, its fragile flame flickering. He was weakening, but he could feel it. The light was not entirely gone, and neither was he. With every bit of willpower left, he took a step forward, holding the candle high. The Sheikh's form twisted in the air, an impossible figure that seemed to devour everything around it. But this time, the shadows hesitated. For a brief moment, the darkness recoiled, and in that instant he saw it. The true key to breaking free was not the candle. It was the choice to fight. He lifted his gaze to the Sheikh's hollow eyes, and for the first time, he felt something stirring deep within him. A surge of clarity, a surge of power, not from the candle, not from the darkness, but from within himself. The flame burned brighter in his hand. The shadows hesitated,